Je déclare ouvert
I declare open the United Nations Forum on the Question of Palestine. The threat of de facto annexation. What next for Palestine? Before we proceed, I would like to note that this event will be webcast live via UN TV. The link is on the screen. To reduce the usage of paper, documents related to this forum and the committee have been put in a virtual folder. You can access it by scanning the QR code near the entrances into your smartphones. Your Excellency, Mr. Oscar Fernandez-Taranco, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, representing here Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Your Excellency, Ambassador the Foreign Minister of Indonesia, Your Excellency, Ambassador Riyad Mansour, Permanent Observer and Representative of the State of Palestine, representatives of governments, intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, and United Nations agencies and programs. Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, it is my privilege and honor to welcome you today to this forum, convened under the auspices of our committee, to exchange ideas and discuss how to address the threat of de jure and de facto annexation of the occupied Palestinian territory and its implication on the two-state solution. I would like to acknowledge the speakers and other participants who have traveled long distances to participate in the forum today. Your presence here is also a demonstration of your unwavering commitment to the Palestinian cause. It is also a testament to the fact that despite the uptick in threats against human rights defenders, no amount of intimidation can silence the voices for peace, and we salute and support that courage.
Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Fernandez-Taranco, to deliver his remarks. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank you for being with us today. You have the floor, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président du Comité.
Thank you very much, Chair of the Committee.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to be here on behalf of the Secretary General here today. Allow me to begin by welcoming you to the opening of the United Nations Forum on the Question of Palestine in support of a peaceful and just solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. The Palestinian question has been on the agenda of our organization almost since its inception, over 70 years ago. Some of the first decisions and engagements of the United Nations had been aimed at resolving that conflict, and the UN remains deeply involved. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict also goes to the heart of the Charter of the UN and its fundamental principles based on the painful experiences of 2 world wars, that conflicts be solved without recourse to violence, that the dignity and worth of the human person be respected, and that the acquisition and annexation of territory of another state by force are inadmissible. Over the near century that has passed since the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began, the international community and the United Nations have been unable to put an end to the occupation and realize a just and lasting peace. As a result, Palestinians have endured prolonged occupation and the denial of their legitimate right to self-determination and statehood. The peace process has stalled. Voices of hate and confrontation are deepening mistrust and posing a constant challenge to reaching a sustainable peace. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, the situation is not moving in the direction of sustainable peace. As we have witnessed over the last weeks, security incidents and provocations continue to dangerously escalate the already precarious situation in the Gaza, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and at times inside Israel. The indiscriminate launching of rockets from Gaza into Israel and the subsequent Israeli military strikes on Gaza threaten to derail the precarious calm. A new conflict would be devastating for the Palestinian people. It would have consequences for Israelis who live in the vicinity of the Gaza perimeter and would be likely to have regional repercussions. The Secretary General and his special coordinator have called on all sides to exercise maximum restraint as the situation remains extremely tense. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza remains defined by prolonged suffering and deep despair. The coastal enclave remains under severe closures and restrictions on the freedom of movement of people and goods, while the military build-up by Hamas and other militant groups continues. Gaza is an integral part of the Palestinian state, and Palestinian unity is needed for a politically stable, economically viable, sovereign and independent state of Palestine. I welcome the tireless efforts of Egypt to continue dialogue with Palestinian factions with the aim of maintaining stability in Gaza and achieving genuine reconciliation. I urge all parties to remain engaged in this critical effort. I urge Israel to lift restrictions on the movement of people and goods with due consideration of its legitimate security concerns. Unless these restrictions ease, the Palestinian economy can never be self-sustaining or generate enough tax revenues for the Palestinian Authority to sustain its operation without donor support. These restrictions also hamper the efforts of the United Nations and other humanitarian agencies. In the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, planning and construction of Israeli settlements continue to advance unabated. I reiterate that settlements are illegal under international law and remain a substantial obstacle to peace. Recent developments relating to the Palestinian Authority's clearance revenues have put the stability and the very existence of the Palestinian Authority at grave risk. Unless the standoff is resolved, it could have a substantial impact on the Palestinian economy, resulting in reduced purchasing power and further reduction in the GDP growth, both in the West Bank and Gaza. Both parties should continue to implement their bilateral agreements and avoid taking unilateral actions that undermine the two-state solution. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, leaders have a responsibility to their populations to reverse this negative trajectory and pave the way towards peace, stability, and reconciliation. The only way to achieve the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people and lasting peace and security for Israel is through the two-state solution. As the Secretary General often reiterates, there is no plan B. It is well past time to resolve the conflict, and the solution is clear. Indeed, has been clear for a long time. The realization of the vision of two states, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states, based on relevant UN resolutions, long-held principles, previous agreements, and international law. The parties to the conflict owe it to their citizens, to future generations of Israelis and Palestinians, and their international community owes it to them to exert all possible efforts to break the cycle of violence, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
I thank you, Mr. Assistant Secretary General, for your statement. The committee appreciates greatly the unwavering support of the Secretary General and of the UN Secretariat towards the discharge of the mandate of the committee. I will now deliver remarks in my capacity as chair of the Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for years we have witnessed deliberate measures by the State of Israel to permanently alter the character and demographics of the occupied Palestinian territory. These measures have increased the risk of perpetual occupation, turning into de facto annexation, and systematically eroded the possibility of establishing a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. We have witnessed attempts to pass legislation in the Israeli parliament that would essentially establish Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Palestinian territory. These laws are designed to undermine the very foundations of a sovereign Palestinian state in violation of international law and UN resolutions. The growth of settlements has profoundly fragmented Palestinian land and made the two-state solution harder to achieve. Security Council Resolution 2334 of 2016 calls for an end to the construction of illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. And yet, more than 3,000 housing units are planned in Area C of the West Bank. These structures, including the separation wall, are not temporary edifices that could easily be traded or demolished. They cut deep through the occupied territory, the very land designated for a Palestinian state, and have become permanent dwellings for thousands of Israelis who call the West Bank under the names Judea or Samaria as part of Greater Israel. On the one hand, settlements continue to proliferate, and on the other, demolition and confiscation of Palestinian structures continue to displace Palestinians from their ancestral lands. We know that 3/4 of the estimated 13,000 structures pending demolition are on private Palestinian land and will cause further displacement and suffering. The international community has condemned these actions before, and I once again call on Israel to cease the construction of illegal settlements and halt demolitions of Palestinian structures. The decision by some states to move their embassies to Jerusalem is another disconcerting development with serious implications on the future state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital. We are nonetheless encouraged to note that similar decisions by some member states have since been rescinded, and we encourage all member states to follow suit. Any unilateral moves to change the political, religious, and cultural character of Jerusalem, a city sacred to 3 religions, would be detrimental to the cause of peace and stability in the Middle East. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the committee firmly believes that true freedom, peace, justice, and security can only be achieved through a two-state solution. All outstanding issues, including borders, the refugees' right to return, and Jerusalem, should be addressed as part of final status negotiations. Security Council Resolution 472 of 1980 calls for maintaining the status quo on Jerusalem until final status negotiations. We will continue to champion these objectives until there is a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel within secure and recognized borders. To our Palestinian brothers and sisters, I would like to underscore that national unity is fundamental, especially now when creeping annexation is systematically eroding the feasibility of Palestinian sovereignty and statehood. I call on Palestinian leaders to constructively engage in reconciliation and resolve the current political impasse. To the international community, I say that if you are genuine and serious about a future Palestinian state, you must stop the laissez-faire attitude that turns a blind eye to Israel's indifference to the broader questions of peace. Israel must be held accountable for its actions by member states, enforcing United Nations resolutions and international law in their dealings. That's the end of my statement. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like now to request the representative of the State of Palestine, Ambassador Riyad Mansour, permanent observer of the State of Palestine to the UN, to deliver his remarks. You have the floor.
So the minister is not speaking?
She will speak after. She will speak after.
I yield to her.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm delighted, to be on the podium with the distinguished Foreign Minister of Indonesia. Indonesia is a very close friend of the Palestinian people and the Palestine cause, and we appreciate all of their efforts in this direction. And also, I am delighted to be sharing the stage with my good friend, Oscar Taranco, who spoke on behalf of the Secretary General. We express our gratitude and thanks to the committee for organizing this meeting, for the Bureau, for you, Mr. Chairman, and for the Division of Palestinian Rights who are so active in making these events the successful events that we all participate in. The State of Palestine is very grateful for the committee for extending an invitation to it to participate in this conference at a very high level. And I just gave to the chairman the letter from our foreign minister who expressed regret for not being able to participate in this meeting, and he designated me to represent the State of Palestine in this meeting. I also would like to thank all of the speakers, all those who are with us in this room, all the friends, all the experts, all the NGOs who are participating in this very important forum. We are grateful to you for your steadfastness, for your resiliency in not abandoning the Palestinian people and their cause, and fighting as hard as you can, inspired by the steadfastness of the Palestinian people on the ground, inspired by the heroic resistance of our people defending the holy sites in occupied Jerusalem, and the great march of return in Gaza, and all the struggle of our people in all locations in the occupied land of the State of Palestine, whether in Bil'in, Na'lin, Nabi Saleh, and all the well-known heroic resistance of our people in defending their homeland and staying on the land of Palestine. I am sure that such steadfastness inspire you to work harder than ever in order not to cave under the pressure of those who want us to accept the status quo, and continuing the march until we see the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people accomplished. In this connection, there is tremendous amount of frustration by our people and leadership, and I assume by all of you in this room and many who are not here, from civil society organizations and others. And the frustration is that you articulate in the international community positions on the basis of international law and relevant UN resolution of how this conflict to be resolved, and that this illegal, protracted occupation to end, and the settlements are illegal and need to be stopped in the process of finding ways of how to deal with this cancer, but yet in the same time, we do not see progress in that direction because there is no accountability with regard to Israel. They are getting away with murder. So the frustration is from the fact that our people are fed up with reiteration of principled position and repeating positions that appear to be so stale. We keep repeating them, and nobody is listening, and that situation cannot continue to continue to be the course of the day. Something has to change. In this connection, from our side, as Palestinians, we proposed ideas for a collective process led by the Security Council in order to have a political will to implement the resolutions of the Security Council and the international community. Because, our people are fed up with reiterations of positions from the Secretary General down the line to members in the General Assembly through the Security Council, and business is continuing as usual. That is unacceptable in the case of Palestine. That situation has to change. A political will has to emerge. As I said, from our side, we do not accept the fate of being between a rock and a hard place. The Israeli occupying authority in a ruthless way, denying our people our rights and stealing our land, and the United States of America's administration giving them all the political support and also denying at the political level and the diplomatic level our rights, taking away Jerusalem, and the list is so long and you know it. So to leave us in that situation without transferring your correct political position in which there is global consensus on how to resolve that conflict, to keep it at the abstract level is unacceptable. You need to muster a political will in order to implement this global consensus by ending the occupation and allowing the state of Palestine to enjoy its independence with Jerusalem as its capital. The committee went to Brussels and went to many other places, went to Canada. The Palestinians are doing their share of the struggle. The international community cannot be frozen in place waiting for so-called a grand plan of how to resolve this conflict. In the Security Council, we hear every day 14 members versus 1 of defending the global consensus to end the occupation and to allow the Palestinian people to exercise self-determination and to have the independence of their state. 14-1, and yet we don't see progress in the right direction. We can come and talk about so many details about what's happening in Gaza, what's happening, to the refugees, what's happening in occupied East Jerusalem, but yet the big subject is what are we doing to end this occupation and to end it yesterday, not even, today or tomorrow. And if we do not elevate ourselves to the point of finding practical ways to implement the will of the international community, then one can say the international community is not elevating itself to the level of addressing the national rights of the Palestinian people and not implementing its resolutions. We are becoming the exception to the rule, the question of Palestine, in the Security Council and at the United Nations. And therefore, we need to seek practical ways, whether at the legal level, through the ICC, or in your domestic courts. We need to bring Israel into accountability. We need to make them see that the international community is not relenting in forcing them to respect international law and their obligation under the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations. It is also our obligation as Palestinians to put our house in order, to put an end to this a dark chapter in our history of the split between Gaza and the remaining part of the occupied Palestinian territory. And in this connection, we appreciate the effort of our brothers from Egypt for helping us to do so. But the big responsibility is on the shoulders of the international community and all of its components to do more in a practical way to see this tragedy to be brought to an end. And I can assure you that the Palestinian people will not raise white flags in spite of the tragedies in Gaza and the hundreds martyred and the tens of thousands injured. The Palestinian people are still holding their heads high in a pride way and in a brave way, and they will never surrender. And that is the story of the Palestinian people. Your help is appreciated, but we need the international community to do more. And Mr. Chairman, we will continue working with you until we see the day of the end of the occupation and the independence of the state of Palestine. That day will come. We are completely confident that it will come with the help of all of you and the steadfastness and the resiliency of our people on the ground. And I thank you very much.
I thank you, Excellency and dear friend, and please convey to President Abbas and the Palestinian people the assurances of our support and solidarity. We attach great importance to his efforts to steer the Palestinian people towards an independent and sovereign state of Palestine based on the two-state solution, with Palestine living in peace and security with its neighbors. I'm now pleased and honored to give very soon the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. We really appreciate you being here, and your presence here is another testimony of the strong support of Indonesia to the Palestinian cause. Thank you for being here once again, for making it, and you have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I flew more than 20 hours from Jakarta to New York to attend this forum, to show our resolute support to the Palestine. As a Bureau member of the Committee of Palestine and a current member of the Security Council, Indonesia considers that our meeting today is of great importance. The theme of topic, the threat of the de facto annexation, what next for Palestine, reflect emerging realities in the occupied Palestinian territory. Not only the issue is pertinent, but also pressing and even fundamental. It should be a major concern of the international community without exception. In the past 3 months alone, we have seen unprecedented and arbitrary unilateral measures by the occupying power. The closure of temporary international presence in Hebron, the withholding of the Palestinian tax revenue, and the provocation at the Al-Haram al-Sharif, to name a few. These do not simply threaten the two-state solution. They pose a worrying move to one-state solution based on survival of the fittest. A gradual, inhuman, and de facto annexation is unfolding before our eyes. This situation is becoming more critical, and concrete action by the international community is a must. We must reject, in the strongest possible term, this de facto annexation. And Indonesia wishes to underline 4 points. First, the Palestinian issue must be one of the priorities at the UN and other platforms. Let me reiterate once and again that the Palestinian issue lays at the heart of the Indonesia foreign policy. Indonesia will be persistent in bringing any worrying development in the occupied territory to the attention of all relevant UN bodies. Next month, during Indonesia presidency of the Security Council, together with Palestine, Indonesia with Kuwait will organize an area formula meeting on the issue of illegal settlement in the occupied Palestinian territory. Second, humanitarian situation in the occupied territory requires immediate and concrete measures. UNRWA is again facing a challenging year. It needs more predictable funding. We commend the Organization of Islamic Cooperation for its tremendous initiative by establishing a trust fund called Waqf to support UNRWA's many important programs. Indonesia, too, is taking up its role by doubling our annual contribution to UNRWA core budget and providing additional humanitarian assistance as needed. Last month, for instance, I sent an agreement with UNRWA to provide another humanitarian assistance for Palestinian refugees in Jeras camp in Jordan. Third, violation of international humanitarian and human rights law should not go unnoticed. We are truly concerned with the report of the Human Rights Council International Commission of Inquiry on the violence committed upon Palestinians in Gaza since 31st March 2018. The brutality claimed 183 fatalities by live ammunition, 35 whom were children. We also call for an immediate end to the collective punishment suffered by the people of Gaza. What Israel is doing is way beyond what is permitted by the international humanitarian and human rights law. The UN must take affirmative action. Finally, Indonesia reiterates once and again that the internationally agreed parameters on the Palestinian issue must be respected. We do not see any credible alternative to the two-state solution. It is the only way forward to achieve a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace between the parties. Any future peace plan shall respect the parameters agreed by relevant UN resolution. I also personally call and appeal to those countries intending to move their embassy to Jerusalem not to do so. It is a strong way to demonstrate our solidarity with Palestine and to defend the two-state solution. Mr. Chairman, the state of Palestine and the occupying power are not in a level playing field. We must always remember this. Therefore, it falls on us, the international community, to assist the Palestinians, to narrow the gap and ensure that their rights are well protected. One concrete measure is to strive for the recognition of Palestine as a UN member state. Distinguished delegates, sadly, the suffering of the Palestinian people continue, and prolonged instability in Palestine will negatively affect the stability in the region and beyond. The world must remain with Palestine, and rest assured, Indonesia will do so. And we will continue this journey in deep earnest until the rights of the Palestinian people are fulfilled. I thank you very much.
Madam Minister, thank you for joining us today, and thank you once again for your inspiring remarks. The permanent representative of Indonesia here at the UN is an active and very constructive and a key member of the committee. So we are very proud of Indonesia, which has always been a strong supporter of the rights of the Palestinian people and plays an indispensable role in the activities of our committee here at the headquarters and abroad. At this point, I would like also to recognize two special people who represent, who are really fighting for the rights of the Palestinians. And I would like to mention Professor Michael Lynk, the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights. Thank you for your contribution. I also recognize my friend, Mr. Peter Mulroyan, the representative of UNRWA. And I would like to thank all those who are here individually or through the organizations who are contributing to the advancement of the Palestinian cause. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the opening session of our forum. Once again, I would like to thank our eminent speakers for their valuable statements, which are bound to inform our discussions in the next panels. I urge you to actively and respectfully participate in the discussions. Today, we have the opportunity to make viable and practical recommendations that could contribute in ending the creeping annexation in the OPT and preserving the two-state solution. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of time and to allow for rich discussion in Plenary 1, which will commence immediately after this opening session, we have invited all those representatives of member and observer states and intergovernmental organizations who wish to make statements to send these to the Division of Palestinian Rights of the United Nations Secretariat. They will then be posted on the committee website. I shall now suspend the meeting for a quick moment to allow the first panel to take their seats at the podium, and we'll then continue immediately with the proceedings. Merci. Merci. Merci infiniment. Merci beaucoup. Enchanté de vous connaître. Thank you.
Only friendly advice. All right. I give more than
Because I saw that. So we'll make it 15. I might exceed my 8 minutes. Oh, good. You are in trouble. Don't Cherry. You are in trouble. You are in trouble. I'm only introducing them. Speak slowly.
Channel 2 for video conference, channel But that's speaking to the whole.
Let's start.
Buenos días.
Good morning. At the outset, we would like to apologize for the delayed start to this panel. We were addressing some technical issues in order to introduce our panelists. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to inaugurate the first panel entitled From Occupation to Annexation, Reality in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. The aim of this panel is to provide an overview of the situation on the ground and to showcase de jure and de facto measures leading to the annexation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. These include massive land confiscation, increasing construction in illegal settlements, and the imposition of a regime of regulations and military orders resulting in systemic discrimination and coercion of Palestinians. In addition, there have been explicit calls by Israeli politicians, including members of the government, for the annexation of all or parts of the West Bank. I am pleased to introduce to the podium as moderator of the panel, Mr. Mouin Rabbani. He's an independent analyst, commentator, and researcher specializing in the contemporary Middle East. Mr. Rabbani is a senior fellow with the Institute for Palestine Studies, and has served as principal political affairs officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria. I would like to call on Mr. Rabbani to introduce the other speakers of the panel and to moderate the session. Mr. Rabbani, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. My thanks to the chair, and welcome to all to plenary session 1, From Occupation to the Threat of Annexation, Reality in the Occupied Palestinian Territory. We are fortunate to have 3 outstanding speakers with us this morning. Mr. Raji Sourani will be our first speaker. He can He will unfortunately be speaking with us via video conference because he resides in the blockaded Gaza Strip, and he will be followed by Mr. Ilan Baruch and Mr. Michael Lynk. I will begin by introducing Mr. Sourani. Raji Sourani is the director of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, which he founded in 1995 with a group of fellow lawyers and human rights activists in the Gaza Strip. The center provides legal and other services to victims of human rights abuses in the Gaza Strip to seek justice and reparation. Despite periods of political imprisonment in Israel, Mr. Sourani has maintained an unwavering commitment to promotion and protection of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. He has received many honors for his work, including the Right Livelihood Award for 2003. Mr. Sourani, we're very eager to spend the next 15 minutes hearing your perspective on the panel's question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Muin, and ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and comrades. Well, I would say these days we are commemorating 12 years of illegal, inhuman blockade on the Gaza Strip. And after the course of all these years, Gaza was suffocated, 2 million civilians, socially, economically, and otherwise. And this resulted in brief 65% unpaid or unemployed and 90% under poverty line. Almost 85% of the population depends on UNRWA and other NGOs' aids. So the situation in the Gaza Strip are so bad. This is the biggest man-made disaster. People in Gaza cannot treat their water. We cannot treat our sewage. And we have no way to deal or treat with our electricity. This biggest man-made disaster created due to the siege, which all international human rights organizations, with no exception, including the ICRC, including all UN bodies and special rapporteurs, said in a clear-cut way, this is sort of collective punishment, it's a crime against humanity, and this should be abolished completely, not partially. The Kafka thing, even the Israeli High Court of Justice said nobody should be worried about famine in Gaza because they are counting how many calories each Gazan take. So if this is not racism, what it can be? 12 years of this criminal, illegal, inhuman siege continue and nothing happening. During this period of time, Gaza faced 3 consecutive wars in 5 years, 2008, 2012, and 2014. Even reconstructing Gaza turned to be mission impossible due to siege and blockade. This year, and on the 30th of March, coincided with 1-year anniversary of the Great March of Return, which began in Gaza in protest of this illegal, inhuman siege. Israel, before having this Great March of Return on the 30th of March 2018, they said in a clear-cut way, we will redeploy snipers all over Gaza borders and we will shoot and kill any who comes there. The Commission of Inquiry, besides the numbers of killings and injuries, said in a clear-cut way what had happened in simple words: crime against humanity, and those who perpetrated these crimes should be held accountable. And they suggested that the Human Rights Council should refer this to the Commission of Inquiry, reminding everybody that we are talking about entirely civilian demonstrations and right of civilians to express their opinion of crime practiced for 12 years against them. Gaza, after this great march of return, with more blood, with more uncertainty, with more pessimism towards the future, it seems as if Israel do have absolute free hand towards dealing with everybody in Gaza Strip, shooting, killing, bombing, incursions, and wars. Maybe some suggest and say, because it is, and because they do have the de facto authority Hamas in Gaza, they deserve that. But the situation is not like that. Jerusalem, subjugated for a long period of time, de facto and de jure, for ethnic cleansing for Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims, and for serious wave of Judaizing Jerusalem. They practiced in a way almost have nothing left to negotiate about Jerusalem, and they imposed the fait accompli policy in it. West Bank, almost 70% of it, controlled 100% by the Israelis, and settlements expanding on day-to-day basis, vertically, horizontally. New settlements are built, legal, illegal, and all that connected with bypass roads between these settlements and the Israeli cities and villages. So Palestinian cities, villages, and camps ghettoized, contained within these areas, and they have no leverage for any expansion in the future. Israel not only doing these settlements activities and the confiscation of land, but as you are aware and know, willful killing taking places every day almost, and incursions for villages, cities, and camps, same thing, and the land confiscation didn't stop, for one day. So what we are having in Jerusalem and the West Bank, in simple words, a new brand of apartheid. That's what Israel is doing. This, a new brand of apartheid in the West Bank and the ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem and the siege on Gaza, which includes social, economical suffocation, comes after 25 years of Oslo Accords. 25 years of Oslo Accords, where it was stated in a clear-cut way in the very introduction, Gaza, West Bank, including the Jerusalem one integrity zone. Now we have this, parts and pieces, total disconnection between Gaza and the West Bank, total disconnection between Jerusalem and the West Bank, total disconnection between South and North, and moving between villages and camps and cities rather mission impossible. Oslo Accord, Oslo stated that in May 4th, 1999, the final status negotiation should be concluded. After 25 years of signing Oslo Accords, it's a clear cut that nobody even talking about end of the Israeli occupation. Nobody talking about end of the Israeli occupation, and Israel do flagrant war crimes, flagrant violations. They do crimes against humanity and no accountability whatsoever. When we resort to the Israeli legal system, trying to seek, as it suggested, national remedies within the courts of the occupation, we find in a clear-cut way that these courts provide full legal cover for organized systematic crimes perpetrated against Palestinian civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories. Most recently, the Israeli Knesset passed a law providing the right of self-determination for Jews in historical Palestine, which means in a clear, simple way that Palestinian people have no right of self-determination. There is only one right for the Jews in Israel. So practically and legally and politically, we don't exist for them. We are talking about the Legislative Council in Israel, and law has been enacted by it. So when we try to resort to international mechanism seeking remedies for victims, and we resort to universal jurisdiction in different countries, Spain, UK, Switzerland, or Sweden, we find in a very strange way how within months laws are changed and providing more legal immunity for war criminals from Israel. I do mean with that, and after all these years of experience and cases we represented, it's almost now mission impossible to hold accountable any Israeli in the European countries due to the changes of law made, which making the Israeli suspected war criminals more immune. And when we try to resort to ICC and seek accountability, a lot of political pressure being mounted, and I'm sure that you are aware about the National Security Advisor in the US and his threats to Bensouda and ICC prosecutors. Situation in the occupied territories, I lived one-way ticket all my life here in Gaza and the occupied territories. It has been never ever worse than this. Israel just bringing more and more ingredients to the already terrible and bad and ugly situation in the occupied territories to make living here rather mission impossible. With all these numbers suggested by OCHA and the report about Gaza 2020, which suggests Gaza uninhabitable place, or with the facts regarding West Bank, Jerusalem. Israel just trying to push Palestinians to be good victims, or to leave, or to give up, or to try to see that there is no future for them in this part of the world. I'm sharing you that the situation is hard, tough, unprecedented, especially with the US Trump administration full backing legally and politically, with the full legal political immunity provided everywhere. But I can assure you as well that hard times pushes either or, to give up or to stand for a challenge. We have no right to give up. We have just fair and right cause. Your respected committee, one of the witnesses on that, and it's called the Committee of Unalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Our rights, we will continue fight for it. And we are entitled as a people for the right of self-determination. We will never, ever be good victims. And we will never give up. Nobody can take the strategical optimism from our hearts or minds, irrelevant of the political balance on the ground, how it is, or how mighty Israel is, or how strong their allies are. We will defend our dignity.
If I could interrupt, Raji, and ask you to please begin to wrap up in terms of time constraints. Thank you.
Okay, I will. I was almost concluding. Nobody will take from our hearts or minds our strategical optimism, though Israel do a lot against Palestinian civil society and especially human rights organization, trying to shrink the space for them. But I hope that we will be able to stand and continue with the fight for justice and dignity and our right of self-determination. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Raji. Our next speaker is retired Ambassador Ilan Baruch, who was until recently the policy advisor to the chairperson of the Israeli political party Meretz. He has 36 years of a diplomatic career, which included postings in Asia, Europe, and Africa. Ambassador Baruch was a team member of the Israeli delegation to the Oslo negotiations, the interim negotiations, and participated in various negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, and Egypt on economic agreements. Ambassador Baruch is currently the chairperson of the Policy Working Group, a team of activists devoted to promoting a Middle East peace process based on the two-state paradigm. He is also an editorial board member of the Palestine-Israel Journal and co-founder of the Cultural Center, the Palestine House in Tel Aviv. Ambassador Baruch, the floor is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Rabbani, and thank you for allowing me to come here and speak out. I'm bringing here a voice embedded in the Israeli civil society that quests for peace based on the two-state paradigm. This is a grim task for me, a former Israeli ambassador who served the Israeli government as a diplomatic envoy, advocating its policies while it officially adhered to the two-state solution. At present, when occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories turns into annexation, I have turned from a loyal ambassador into a political activist. I resigned government a number of years ago, and the crux of my motivation was actually that, the departure, the divorce of my government under Netanyahu as Prime Minister and Lieberman as Foreign Minister from the basic fundamental commitment that my government took along the years to transform occupation into a peace agreement. Jerusalem is the core and the microcosm of the Palestine-Israel relations, the occupation, and its transformation into solid annexation. In a paper composed by CEIRPP, an NGO, prestigious NGO based in Jerusalem and is dealing with the Jerusalem case, presented in July last year in a conference in Brussels, the Israeli strategy to consolidate its annexation of Jerusalem was discussed in detail, where the paradigmatic shift in Israel's policy on Jerusalem was on full display. And I truly recommend whoever is interested in the case of Jerusalem to Google CEIRPP, I-R-A-M-I-N, and look into their materials. The Netanyahu government now for several years has taken strides to consolidate its physical control of East Jerusalem, while at the same time it has been systematically weakening the Palestinian capacity to maintain livelihood, education, housing, social fabric, and political leadership in the city. Israel is pursuing to redraw the boundaries of Jerusalem through legislation, through administrative action, and cultural orientation. This is done in order to change the demography of East Jerusalem at the expense of the Palestinians and in favor of Jewish settlers. The Green Line, the June 1967 border, which is supposed to be the basis for a negotiated agreement between Israel and Palestine of a future settlement based on the two-state paradigm, is systematically eroded by Israel. It has an impact felt in the core of the city, enclosed in the ancient walls of it, including the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, and the outer perimeter of the city, where large Palestinian neighborhoods have been walled out and practically disconnected from the heart of their city, East Jerusalem. While the government of Israel is taking consistent strides to unilaterally design the future Jerusalem as a unified city with municipal boundaries that are inclusive of neighboring settlements and exclusive of Palestinian large quarters, the US administration has introduced a far-reaching shift in recognizing the city as Israel's capital while ignoring the Palestinian aspirations and universally recognized entitlement to have its future government of the independent state of Palestine seated in East Jerusalem. And I need to add here that I speak reflectively of the Hebrew discourse in Israel. And I want to make sure that you understand that alongside the Israeli government, and in spite of a large majority of right-wing inclinations in Israel, there is also a strong constituency of people whom I represent here, and who are anxious and concerned with the fact that we are moving in the wrong direction. And we are reaching out as much as it is possible to our Palestinian counterparts and allies to work jointly on this. On the legislative level, the government has promoted bills that would transfer 120,000 Palestinian Jerusalemites residing beyond the barrier in such quarters as Kufr Aqab, Kalandia, or Aram. This was to be done by simply withdrawing the municipal boundaries to exclude them, the most crystal clear case of gerrymandering. And at the same time, a separate motion was aiming to add to Jerusalem municipal boundaries adjacent settlement blocks, such as Ma'ale Adumim E1 to the east, Givat Ze'ev to the north, and Givat HaMatos Gush Etzion to the south, with 140,000 Jewish residents. While moving relentlessly to transform the outer perimeter of the city into an Israeli municipal space, it is also pursuing to change the fabric of the old city, which is the core of this urban space. Demographically, the challenge is tall. Compared with approximately 100,000 Palestinians residing within the walls, only 3,000 Jews live in the Jewish quarter and about the same number in the Muslim quarter. The government of Israel is executing systematic eviction of Palestinian residents in buildings built on land owned in pre-48 Palestine by Jewish individuals or societies. In Sheikh Jarrah, for example, there are now 75 Palestinian families awaiting forced eviction by court order. It is important to note that Palestinians who were possessing property beyond the 48 lines in West Jerusalem have no such luxury to claim this property back. This is a simple, clear case of opposite entitlement. Jews can claim property, Palestinians cannot. In Batad al-Hawa, Silwan, 100 Palestinian families are facing imminent forced eviction on similar grounds. Past experience tells us that once a family is removed from its home onto the street, settlers immediately move in to exercise ownership on the evicted property. There is no way back. In recent years, we have seen projects that serve as touristic settlements. Not only that properties in the public domain are entrusted to extreme nationalist settler NGOs like El-Ad or Ateret Kohanim, but through them a one-sided narrative is being portrayed and consolidated, the Jewish narrative. Such narration of the Israeli story in association with ancient Jerusalem, as well as a modern city, is setting step by step the global perception of the city, where the Palestinian story is simply losing ground and will be extinct in the future not too far if attention is not being paid to this. And I think it is a tall order for the world to do pay attention to this. In addition, massive structures are being built or planned, such as cable car connecting the two parts of the city beyond the Green Line, tunnels under Palestinian neighborhoods portrayed as serving access to archaeological treasures, all exclusively Jewish and state-owned or entrusted to settler NGOs with no Palestinian participation, no Palestinian say, no Palestinian taking part in designing the future of a city that eventually is of both. While the dynamics of deprivation tactics towards the Palestinians take place in the outer perimeter and in the core of the old city, and the immediate vicinity of it, parallel dynamics take place in the Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount itself. But I want to emphasize another point. Since March 2009, when Prime Minister Netanyahu launched his new cabinet, he indicated off and on record his irrevocable divorce from the two-state paradigm leading to peace. In retrospect, his drive to annex the city and the West Bank in general is evident in every move. In a few hours, we Israelis will go to the ballots. Most pundits predict another victory for Netanyahu. But even if he loses, he leaves behind a legacy, a zeitgeist that will take a generation to heal, a lost decade for us all. In a formative speech, and this would be my last point, in a formative speech Netanyahu delivered in Bar-Ilan University 10 years ago, almost to the day, in June 2009, he said, "Let me first say that the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel has lasted for more than 3,500 years. But we must also tell the truth," he says, on record, in public. Within this homeland of the Jews lives a large Palestinian community. We do not want to rule over them. This is a fundamental conviction of Netanyahu. The land is in exclusive possession of the Jewish people. The Palestinians are a large community in residence on Jewish-owned land. I recognize the presence of Ambassador Mansour. Neither he nor any Palestinian leader, neither any Palestinian individual would ever be prepared to accept this formula: exclusively owned Jewish land and Palestinian community, however large, in residence as guests on a Jewish land. That is an absurd. But this is what governs the collective mentality of my government at this point. Recently, in July last year, the same idea comes in the Jewish nation-state law, rendering the Palestinian Israelis living within Israel inferior status. The Jews have exclusive rights to purchase land in Israel. The Arabic language, hitherto equal to its status with Hebrew, is now demoted to a lower level. In a recent skirmish over the social media with a television presenter, he responded, and I quote, "Israel is not a country of all its citizens. According to the nation-state law that we passed, Israel is a nation-state of the Jewish nation, and it's alone." And one can only add guessing without any hesitation, and Greater Jerusalem is its eternal capital. It is for us all, the international community that you are sitting here on behalf of, and the civil society globally and in Israel itself, which I represent here. It is an urgent task to regroup and rethink our tactics and strategy, to change the trajectory of the dynamics in the Middle East in a way that allows the Palestinians a proud state alongside Israel within the territory of the Green Line of 67. We take enlightenment in the Security Council Resolution 2334 of December 23rd, 16, which demands distinguishing between Israel and the occupied territory beyond the Green Line. That is our vision just as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would now like to introduce our last speaker in this session, Mr. Michael Lynk is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. Mr. Lynk is also Associate Professor of Law at Western University in London, Ontario. Prior to becoming an academic, he practiced labor law and refugee law for a decade in Ottawa and Toronto, Canada. He also worked for the United Nations on human rights and refugee issues in Jerusalem. Mr. Lynk has written widely on labor law and human rights issues in Canada and published articles on the application of international law to the Middle East conflict. He has regularly acted as a labor arbitrator in Canada. Mr. Lynk received his BA and LLB from Dalhousie University and completed his LLM at Queen's University in 2001. Mr. Lynk, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the honor of speaking on this distinguished panel and at this important conference. My presentation today is going to be drawn from my October 2018 report to the General Assembly here in New York, which had a focus on annexation. And those of you who may be interested in it, going deeper into the issue of the legal aspects of annexation and the patterns on the ground, you can find it on the Special Procedures website of the Human Rights Council. What I want to be able to do today is discuss both the law with respect to annexation. I want to be able to discuss the issue of the patterns of annexation going on in the West Bank and just draw some conclusions with respect to this. As you can see from the slide above, annexation is strictly prohibited under international law. This came in the years after 1945 and the bitter experience of decades of global wars that have been fueled by ambitions for territorial expansionism. The international community resolved to forbid war, conquest, and annexation as instruments of national policy. The Charter of the United Nations in Article 2 requires UN members to settle their differences by peaceful means, with the corollary that annexation has now become illegal. The 1970 Declaration on Friendly Relations, adopted unanimously by the UN General Assembly, declared that, quote, no territorial acquisition or special advantage arising from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal. The United Nations General Security Council, beginning in 1967, has expressly affirmed the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war or by force for at least eight occasions, beginning with Resolution 242. I want to draw attention to a statement made by the Israeli Prime Minister last week when he returned to Tel Aviv from Washington after receiving the declaration by the American administration that was going to recognize the Israeli annexation in the Golan Heights from 1981. Prime Minister Netanyahu stated, everyone says that you can't hold an occupied territory, but this proves that you can. If occupied in a defensive war, then it's ours. I want to be able to say that's not the opinion of the vast majority of international scholars who work on issues of war, peace, occupation, and annexation. As you can see from the final comment up there on the screen, Sharon Corman, who wrote the definitive book in 1997, said that the acquisition of territory by war, whether defensive or aggressive, is inadmissible. The next slide I have up here comes from a very recent book, which I highly recommend to all of you, called The Internationalists, written by two Yale law scholars in 2017. And what this shows, I think, is that when you marry international law with international resolve, the scourges of the past can at least be dampened and maybe even extinguished. What they showed was that in the 110 years between 1815 or 1816 to 1928, which was the signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war, there had been an average of 1.21 conquests per year, with the acquisition of almost 300,000 square kilometers annually. In the next period of time, between 1928 and 1948, during the initial period after the Kellogg-Briand Pact, there was only a slight decline in the patterns of conquest and annexation. There was an average of 1.15 conquests per year, involving an average of around 240,000 square kilometers. However, and this is the big change, since 1948, with the arrival of the United Nations, with the proclamation of the Charter of the United Nations, and with the beginning of the passage of a whole host of human rights and international humanitarian law instruments, what we've seen is a vast dampening of that urge towards annexation. What they determined was that in the years since 1948, there's only been an average of 0.26 conquests per year, amounting to an annual average of around 15,000 square kilometers per year. And in many cases, even where there has been a conquest and a proclamation of annexation, this may be a legal victory, a military victory, but it does not wind up being a lasting legal victory, which is recognized by the international community. The next slide I want to show has to do with the definition of annexation, because we talk about both de jure annexation, actual annexation, and de facto annexation, where land is being ceded, if you like, with all of the standards of trying to obtain sovereignty without yet reaching that stage of declaring formal de jure annexation. It's my contention, and I expand this in some length in my October 2018 report, that there is and should not be in law any meaningful difference between de jure annexation and de facto annexation. Both, I think, stand to be illegal under modern international law, and I express 4 tests with respect to this. The first has to do with effective control. If a state is in the effective control of the territory of which it is formally acquired from another state, then that is one element towards determining whether or not de facto and therefore illegal annexation has occurred. The second, is that state taking exercises towards sovereignty? Are they taking measures which indicate the making of a permanent and effective claim for sovereignty over parts or all of the territory that they are presently ruling under occupation, such as bringing in prohibited changes to local legislation, or bringing in its own domestic laws into application, or involving the demographic transformation of that territory by settling its own civilian population into it, or the granting of citizenship. The third test is our expressions of intent, and this would include statements made by leading political leaders of the occupying state or of state institutions which are indicating or advocating for the permanent annexation of part or all of that territory. And finally, what's been the direction of international law? Has this particular state refused to take either international direction from the international community to give up that territory, or is it in violation of the laws of occupation and international humanitarian law with respect to the determination of the future status of that territory and ensuring that it winds up being handed back to the proper sovereigns, which are the people under occupation? I'm not going to touch upon the next several slides. I think there's 4 of them you can go through, you can skip through, on East Jerusalem. Not to say that East Jerusalem isn't an important issue, but I think my colleague, Ambassador Baruch, has adequately discussed, certainly sufficiently discussed that. I want to turn specifically to the factors coming to annexation with respect to the West Bank. Israel, as you know, has yet to declare its formal de jure annexation of any part of the occupied West Bank outside of the areas in and around East Jerusalem, primarily because it lacks international political support from any quarter for that particular move. Its official position to the rest of the world is that while it denies that the laws of occupation apply to the West Bank as to the rest of the OPT, it remains willing to negotiate its future status with the Palestinians. But in practice, Israel has taken multiple steps consistent with establishing a sovereign claim over the West Bank since shortly after its occupation began in June of 1967, and these steps have accelerated significantly in recent years. I want to be able to take you through 3 steps, which I think help to establish those 4 legal tests that I described to you a few minutes ago. The first trend has to do with how Israel has consolidated its control over the West Bank. During its 5 decades of occupation, Israel has steadily entrenched its sovereign footprint over the West Bank. The infrastructure of the territory, the sewage connections, the communication systems, the electrical network have been completely integrated into Israel's domestic system. The West Bank's water system, with its plentiful mountain aquifers, have been owned and managed and controlled since 1982 by Merkarot, which is Israel's modern national water enterprise, with the benefits flowing primarily back to Israel. The highway system, which before 1967 was a predominantly north-south system in the West Bank, has now been reconfigured into an east-west system in order to be able to connect the settlements with each other and with Israeli cities, thereby disrupting Palestinian transportation. The West Bank economy is subject to a single customs union agreement with Israel, enabling the more powerful economy to dominate and flourish, while the weaker economy withers through de-development and dependence. The natural resources of the West Bank have been largely controlled by Israel and are primarily exploited for its benefits. Israel legislation and laws have been extended by the Israeli military commander to the West Bank on a personal territorial basis, and now we're beginning, as I'll come to in a few minutes, the extension of Knesset laws going directly to the West Bank. We are reaching a stage of what I think is no longer creeping annexation, but what I will call either leaping annexation, or to use a term favored by both Israeli and international NGOs, occu-annexation, which is, I think, a brand new term in the English language. So that is the first trend. The second trend has to do with the extension by statute, by the Israeli Knesset, of several important pieces of legislation going directly to the West Bank settlements. I'll just mention 2. There are a number that I've listed there, but the first has to do with the settlement regularization law in Judea and Samaria. And this law allows for the retroactive legalization of outposts built on private Palestinian land. While the legislation allows compensation to Palestinian landowners, it denies them any right to property restoration. It was passed by the Knesset a little more than 2 years ago in February 2017, but it remains unimplemented due to a legal challenge to it in the Israeli High Court by a number of Israeli human rights organizations. What I fear about it, though, is its prospective use, particularly if parts or all of it is declared to be lawful. And indeed, you see in the justification for some subsequent laws that Israel is relying upon the nation-state law, which we'll come to in a second, for the justification for the settlement regularization law. And the nation-state law, which was mentioned a minute ago by Ambassador Baruch, is something as well that's very important. What particularly affects the West Bank with respect to the nation-state law is Article 7. The nation-state law has acquired the status of a basic law in Israel, which means it's part of its quasi-constitutional network. And Article 7 says, and I quote, "The state views the development of Jewish settlements as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation." There is no territorial limit with respect to the nation-state law, so it's a natural assumption that the nation-state law actually applies not just simply to Israel behind its 1948 borders, but to the territories it owns or it occupies and rules over. And the third trend that I want to draw to your attention to is the fact that the Israeli political leadership has now become much more uninhibited in the past 2 years in expressing out loud what its actions have been proclaiming for years. Annexation is in the air, and the intention is now being openly expressed in words as well as deeds. And I've given you a number of statements here made by leading Israeli cabinet ministers, including the Prime Minister, with respect to their intention to either permanently annex all of the West Bank or occupy and annex significant portions of it. That is really the only major debate among the Israeli center-right. Do we take all of the land and figure out some sort of status for the Palestinians living there, or do we annex only 2/3 of the land and figure out some other condominium relationship for the Palestinians that are there? In conclusion, may I say this: a fundamental tenet of international law is the legal maxim that a lawbreaker cannot benefit from his or her illegal act. In 1967 and again in 1980, the international community clearly stated that Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem breached international law and was null and void, and it repeated that during Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights in 1981. The international community has also spoken decisively about the illegality of the Israeli settlement enterprise, which is the political and demographic engine which has transformed Israel's occupation into an annexation. Yet lacking in any of these repeated condemnations of Israel's annexation actions has been any meaningful steps by the international community to insist upon accountability. Despite Israel's ongoing record of non-compliance with the directions of the international community, it has rarely paid a meaningful price for its defiance and its appetite for entrenching its annexational ambitions in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Nothing could be more effective, I think, than to refute this particular trend, that international law is closer to power than to justice, than for the international community to act on the overwhelming evidence in front of it and to insist that Israel either fully annul its annexations and relinquish its occupation, or be prepared to bear the full consequences of accountability for its mocking of international law. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Ambassador Mahdiev of the Organization of the Islamic Conference.
Hello. Thank you very much. I would like at the outset to convey to you the greetings of His Excellency Dr. Yusuf Al-Utaimin, the Secretary General of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, and his wishes of success for this seminar. We also express our appreciation to the Committee of the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, the Chairman, His Excellency Ambassador Sheikh Nian, and all the distinguished members of its Bureau for their laudable efforts and initiative in support of the Palestinian cause. This seminar takes place at a difficult juncture, overburdened by challenges over nearly a quarter of a century of negotiations that provided Israel with political cover to maintain its prolonged colonial occupation and undermine prospects for two-state solution, though its obstinacy in perpetrating its illegal actions, creating de facto realities on the ground, and keeping its commitments and obligations so far unmet. Besides, the Israeli measures and actions aimed at altering its Palestinian Arab Islamic identity of the occupied city of Jerusalem, Judaizing and tampering with its legal and historical status, changing its demographic composition and isolating it from the Palestinian surroundings have become commonplace. The sad fact is that in spite of all UN resolutions, along with international efforts and measures taken, Israel's violations continue to take place at an alarming rate. The prevailing challenges cannot be seen in isolation from measures, statements, and decisions that show complete bias in favor of the Israeli colonial occupation through unilaterally recognizing Jerusalem as so-called capital of Israel and unlawfully relocating some diplomatic missions in defiance of international law and the relevant UN resolutions. Such illegal acts would make up a reality on the ground. However, they will not create any right, will not gain any legitimacy, and will certainly weaken the international system, deepen further the current political impasse. Definitely, the ongoing Israeli colonial settlement policies fortifying Israel's decades-long occupation remains the core challenge to the will of the international community. It's a litmus test for the international collective resolve to take concrete actions to ensure Israeli respect for and compliance with UN resolutions and compel it to halt the unilateral acts slated to undermine the international endorsed two-state solution. Worse, even the deteriorating situation is steadily yet more dangerous due to the recent decision of the Israeli authorities to confiscate financial assistance from Palestinian monthly tax revenues. Such illegal decision is considered an act of piracy and collective punishment for the Palestinian people, another violation of international law and Israeli commitments under signed conventions. The OIC urged in this regard the international community to exert pressure on Israel to end its arbitrary measures which exacerbate the financial, economic, and humanitarian crisis encountered by the Palestinian people. Indeed, the Israeli siege continued to affect the entire life of the Palestinian people in Gaza Strip, prevent access of humanitarian aid and basic materials, impede the development efforts to reconstruct the damaged infrastructure, and obstruct economic and social recovery. We reaffirm the need to immediately lift the illegal Israeli blockade, which constitutes an ongoing human rights violation, collective punishment, and war crime. These new challenges have compounded the already dire situation, making it incumbent on the international community to ensure that their position, efforts, and role be built on their political, legal, and moral obligations under international law and UN resolution. We believe that accomplishing the objective of this esteemed committee, which aims to redress the historical injustice inflicted on the Palestinian people and enable them to restore their legitimate rights, requires active engagement in a multilaterally sponsored political process within a defined time frame with a view to ending the Israeli occupation and realizing the two-state solution. In closing, I would like to reaffirm the OIC support to the Palestinian people in their endeavor to regain their national inalienable rights, including their right to self-determination, to return, and the establishment of the independent Palestinian state on their national soil, with East Jerusalem as its capital. I wish this seminar full success, and I hope it achieves its noble objectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've had the opportunity, I think, to listen to three very interesting presentations. Raji Sourani, who focused primarily on the Gaza Strip, then Ilan Baruch, who focused primarily on Jerusalem, and then Michael Lynk, who focused primarily on the West Bank. And listening to these three presentations, it seems to me that if it were up to Israel, perhaps we shouldn't talk so much about the end of the two-state paradigm, but rather the transformation of the two-state paradigm, in the sense that one gets the impression that we are on the ground heading to a two-state reality in which one state consists of the Gaza Strip, over which Israel no longer claims sovereignty, even if formally it remains an occupation of the Gaza Strip, perhaps with some autonomous enclaves in the West Bank. And the second state is Israel incorporating much or perhaps all of the West Bank. And so if I could perhaps kick off the discussion and ask the three speakers whether they agree that Israel is perhaps trying to push for this scenario, and second of all, what it means. And I refer, for example, to the magisterial work of Norman Finkelstein, in which he seeks to demonstrate that Israel can no longer be considered in occupation of the occupied territories, because occupation is, of course, a legally recognized status under international law. And as Michael Lynk, I think, demonstrated quite effectively, what we're seeing now is an annexation, or I think used the term occu-annexation, and no longer an occupation as most people would recognize it under international law. So, and what would be the consequences of this reality? So could I begin by throwing this question out to our three panelists, and Raji, perhaps we could start with you.
Yes, thank you, Maureen. I think Palestinians cannot say we want one or two state solution. If we say we want one state solution, that will be interpreted and translated all the way along as they call for destruction of Israel. PLO Charter, the day it was established, it called for one state, secular, democratic, for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. So are we back to square number one? But that's, was it changed to two-state solution after Olaf Palme and Bruno Kreisky intervened with President Arafat in 1974. And they convinced him that if he recognized the state of Israel and be satisfied with the 22% of historical Palestine, the world would support him, which didn't. Now, if we say we want one state solution, I think, Israel will interpret it like they are calling for throwing Jews into the sea. And I think this is unwise because we have a lot of international UN resolutions and different bodies with supporting a two-state solution, and that will put us in a limbo, legally and politically. The fact on the ground is absolutely different. Yes, Israel ruling out the situation in the West Bank, Jerusalem ethnically cleansed from Palestinians, almost the mission accomplished, the Judaization of Jerusalem almost there and finished, and de facto and de jure Jerusalem, nothing left to be negotiated about. The West Bank almost 70%, as all we know. They are imposing this situation, and PA, I think, will ultimately vanish by the departure of President Abbas. It's a matter of time. It doesn't have really the basis, to existence there. So yes, Israel going all the way long with no hesitation, and this is bold, on the record, stated by ministers in the government, and no one single Israeli political party right now from the coalition suggests that there will be two-state solution. No, everybody says two-state solution ruled out. Now, on the other side, Gaza, there is this dosage of 2 million people. What to do with them? Israel tried all its mighty means to try to make Gaza, it's mission impossible to live in this part of the world, to have Gaza inhabitably place. And I don't know how we are surviving, actually. The fact, the people still here, it's rather accomplished mission impossible. All conditions of life makes you think of leaving this part. Despair, unemployment, poverty, death everywhere, this, etc. So the fact that Israeli occupation is here, and occupation, as Michael Lynk suggested rightly, occupation means effective control of the life of civilians, and they are effectively controlling our life from A to Z. And the concrete example is the blockade. In Gaza, they decide what kind of macaroni we eat, what kind of clothes we wear, whether we have gas or not, whether we have fuel for the electricity or not. They decide anything, and they can get anybody in the Gaza Strip, in the 365 square kilometers. So they are thinking of something, how we manage with this place called Gaza, without having any sort of control of the life of the people here. So two-state solution, in simple words, unfeasible. It's ruled out. I don't think we Palestinians should say that. Let the Israeli themselves say that. Meanwhile, I think in the Gaza Strip, they are thinking of having sort of solution for this place after they realized and they knew getting rid of 2 million people, it's mission impossible. And people are not leaving with all the pressure, they are having, even with making Gaza animal farm, international community dumping to it some food and medicine. It's era of uncertainty, and I think we are heading soon to new political era where things are much more clearer, and that would be determined more by Israel regional and international factors.
Thank you. Ilan Baruch, when we look at the very different approaches that Israel is taking towards the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and having just heard what Raji has said, are we looking at an effort by the Israeli government to transform or eliminate the two-state paradigm?
It is very obvious that now for quite a long time, the government was pursuing, almost a decade, pursuing a policy that would eliminate the opportunity for an independent, liberated Palestine to survive alongside Israel. The American administration, previous to the current, was making the last attempt under the Kerry initiative to negotiate starting situation for a negotiated two-state agreement, but he failed dismally. He launched it in July 2013 and aborted it in April 14. And you could see that the reason for him to go back home was the lack of readiness on the Israeli side to assist in consolidating the capacity of the Palestinian leadership to actually negotiate from a position of relative strength and deliver to the Palestinian constituency, to the people, a negotiated compromise that will ensure the basic Palestinian interests. I think the lack of my government's readiness to abide by its own commitment to release prisoners was the last stone dropped in eliminating this attempt. And since then, we are actually bogged down in a stalemate that is corrosive, that is dangerously undermining any future new attempt to negotiate peace. Comes in the American administration under Trump with a fantastic idea to sell a done deal to the parties without any negotiations. And on the way, paving the way for this, instead of consolidating, instead of strengthening the hand of the Palestinian leadership to be able to sustain the struggle to convince Palestinians in the likelihood, in the feasibility of a deal, they were doing everything to undermine. First with this one-sided recognition of Jerusalem, then removing the refugee return issue from the table, as Trump said, then removing American assistance to the Palestinians either directly or through UNRWA, and even the Golan Heights, the latest, in my view, catastrophic American move to declare recognition of Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights has very little to do with the Golan Heights and has to do with the precedent that Israel was all the time trying to achieve with reference to the West Bank. And I was listening carefully to the dissertation provided us by Professor Lynk, and I think not much of it is yet and needs to be introduced to the Israeli public because people in Israel simply accept it. I think that we need a two-pronged approach here. First of all, from the level of civil society, we need a robust fight in protecting human rights that are being disregarded by the Israeli government towards Palestine and Palestinian society. And here the global civil society has a lot to say. And at the same time, from governments and of course international organizations as the one we are now hosted by, we need to see an entirely new approach, not simply repeating the old style advocacy that is being rehearsed time and again, but we need a new approach that will convince the Israel government and the Israelis as society that their interest is actually in abiding by the international demand on the creation of Palestine alongside Israel rather than simply advocating it. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Lynk, you laid out a clear case as to why the reality has transformed into one of annexation, and you concluded by emphasizing the importance of political will and of the international community in ensuring that this is not allowed to pass, if I can paraphrase. Mm-hmm. So, having just listened to what Ilan Baruch said, specifically about the policies coming out of Washington, how do you propose to muster that political will to ensure that annexation is not permitted to proceed?
Sure. Very good question, and thank you for that. I guess my primary plea to the international community has to be a rethink of how it approaches what is going on in the occupied Palestinian territory. Because if we're actually right, if we're actually witnessing with our eyes wide open an annexation being transformed into an annexation, then I think we have to end a number of our prior policy assumptions. And the biggest one is this. Resolution 2334 was passed by the Security Council a little more than 2 years ago. And there was much to commend in that resolution with respect to the reiteration of the application of the laws of occupation, with respect to the illegality of the Israeli settlements, and that settlements must stop, and that they're the biggest hindrance to the achievement of Palestinian self-determination. But Resolution 2334 also contained what I think is an unsustainable assumption. And that assumption actually goes to unsustainability. It's said in Resolution 2334 that the ongoing occupation is not sustainable. I'm afraid I beg to differ with respect to that. I think that this assumption is premised on the supposedly irreducible fact that Israel has no demographic or political choice but to withdraw from all or most of the occupied territory and allow a sovereign Palestinian state to emerge if it is to preserve its Jewish character and democratic values. I think that assumption has gone with the wind with respect to this. I think even as the character of the occupation is being transformed into a de facto annexation, and even as influential media organs such as the New York Times and the Guardian of England have acknowledging the shallow last breaths of the two-state solution, Europe and the international community has continued to play diplomatic checkers while Israel is playing diplomatic chess. This working assumption of unsustainability, I think, is being left behind by the galloping realities of the occupation. Just let me name you 5, which I identify. First of all, I think this assumption of unsustainability fails to account for the creative thinking among the ascendant Israeli right that it can comfortably live with models of permanent rule over the Palestinians that would deny them citizenship and democratic rights while taking their land. Secondly, it overlooks the striking degree of control that Israel exercises over the Palestinians as it confines them to smaller, denser, and more fragmented islands of land through its sophisticated network of walls, checkpoints, control over the population registry, and overwhelming military superiority. Third, I think this assumption of unsustainability overestimates the willingness of the Oslo partners, particularly Europe, which is Israel's largest trading partner, and the United States, which is its diplomatic and military patron, to challenge Israel with any meaningful consequences should it retreat, as it obviously has, from any lingering commitment to a genuine two-state formula. Fourth, I think this assumption disregards Oslo's escape clauses, which have allowed Israel to pocket the largely cost-free features of the occupation, which are the large amounts of European and international aid to fund the Palestinians, and the annual now almost $4 billion in military aid provided to Israel by the United States, while Israel is allowed to continue to thicken its presence throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while also blockading Gaza. And fifth and finally, I think this assumption begs the question of whether a genuine two-state solution was ever possible in the absence of the international community's political will to enforce the clear obligations and prohibitions of international law that could have stemmed Israel's expansionism over the past half-century.
Thank you. I'd now like to give the floor to the representative of Angola.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is an honor for us to participate in this forum on the question of Palestine. We have always been invested in a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we continue to believe that a peaceful resolution of this conflict can have positive consequences for the region as a whole. To begin, I'd like to quote the Angolan President, His Excellency João Lourenço, as he addressed the Russian Parliament yesterday. I quote, "It is our hope that the world will agree on the need to respect all the UN Security Council resolutions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with a view to ending the decades-long suffering of the Palestinian people and guaranteeing them the inalienable right to have a homeland, a state with a seat at the United Nations and in other international organizations." End of quote. Taking into consideration the changing landscape of conflicts across the world, we join our voice to those that believe in the importance of dialogue and cooperation. Multilateral organizations such as UN are an important venue for us to conduct meetings such as this forum, where we can not only share ideas, but hopefully influence decision makers. The rising tension in the Middle East is only exacerbated by the lack of progress in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, in particular, the fact that Palestinians have endured more than half of a century of occupation and denial of their legitimate right of self-determination. Israeli unlawful seize of Palestinian land and expansion of settlements only perpetuates the immense suffering by punishing Palestinians out of their homes, destroying their livelihoods and depriving them of basic needs. What is even worse is that continuous settlement activity and efforts to bolster tourism to them, or any other activity which seeks to normalize the Israeli occupation, is making the possibility for a two-state solution even harder to achieve. Mr. President, this threat of a de facto annexation is a counterproductive to any peace prospects between Israelis and Palestinians. As approximately 2 million Palestinians remain mired in increasing poverty and unemployment with limited access to adequate health, education, water, and electricity, Israel continues to flaunt its wealth and power by supporting settlements activity and the occupation. We urge Israel, without natural jeopardizing legitimate security concerns, to lift restrictions on the movement of people and goods, which also impair the efforts of the United Nations and other humanitarian agencies, and to cease all settlement activity. On the other side, the need of Palestinian unity is imperative for a politically stable, economically viable, sovereign, and independent state of Palestine. In conclusion, we hope that this forum serves its purpose to galvanize the international community in the right direction of this critical issue. It is critical that we all help realize the potential both the Israelis and the Palestinians have, and which can only be achieved through peace and mutual cooperation. We reiterate our conviction that the only reliable outcome must be the two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace, with secure and recognized borders, and with Israel as the capital of both states. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, and I'd now like to give the floor to the representative of the State of Palestine.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Professor Sourani and to Ambassador Baruch and to Professor Lynk for their compelling presentations. My question is for Professor Lynk and for Ambassador Baruch. You both referred to Security Council Resolution 2334, and with due consideration to Professor Lynk's reservations about the resolution's reference to the unsustainability of the occupation and the situation, I would refer to the call by the Council upon all states to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967, and would ask you, what would your recommendations be to the international community, to member states, to their parliaments, to NGOs, the private sector, to global citizenry, individually and or collectively, for action to give effect to this call in practical terms, and for states in upholding their obligation not to recognize internationally illegal acts, and also their obligations to ensure accountability of international law, all as a means of imposing consequences for the continuation of the occupation and for acts and measures amounting to annexation, but also at the same time as a means of contributing to bringing this illegal situation to an end and ultimately to a just and peaceful solution of this conflict. I would welcome your reflections.
Thank you, Madam, for asking this question, because it is down to the point in pertinence with what we are doing here. My line of conviction within the Israeli discourse, we are strongly supporting the idea of positive agenda, which means we are calling the international community to reach out and embrace Israel in the fullest all the way to the Green Line, but none of any preferential treatment of Israel beyond the Green Line. It is very evident that Israel is not a good target for boycotting. It is very powerful economically, technologically, militarily, and you name it. And simply applying a wall-to-wall boycott on Israel is impractical, and at the same time it is also carrying a message that is allowing recruitment of the Israelis around the flag of defiance of opposition to the world order. And what we are trying to offer as a line of working on this is differentiation. It is alluded to in the Security Council Resolution 2334 in using the word distinguish between Israel proper and the occupied territories. We use the European term differentiation, which is in the base of the labeling of settlement products within the European Union market. I think that if we could have stepped up, upgraded and internationalized a policy of differentiations toward the Israeli occupation, or to the most prominent instrument of occupation, which is a settlement project and enterprise, we could have seen a gradual shift. And I can tell you that we Israelis who are in opposition to government, we are actually seeking to have international support in this way to our work. Thank you.
Sure. Just to add to what Ambassador Baruch has said, I remind the delegates here today that international law requires, not only through Resolution 2334, but a long-standing resolution from 1980, which is Resolution 465 from the Security Council, also calls upon Israel, all states not to provide Israel with any assistance that could be used specifically in connection with settlements in occupied territories. There's a long-standing practice in international law with respect to the obligations of third parties not to assist with the continued encouragement or occurrence of violations of human rights. We see that in Common Article Number 1 of the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, which not only asks the high contracting parties to respect, but also to ensure respect for all of the principles articulated in the Geneva Conventions. We see that in Article 41 of the International Law Commission's Articles on State Responsibility, which requires states will not recognize as lawful a situation created as a serious breach of a peremptory norm of international law, nor are states to render aid and assistance in maintaining that situation created by the breach. Both of those provisions apply with capital letters to the situation of the settlements in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. So what international law winds up requiring is what we call the duty of non-recognition. That goes beyond simply debating whether or not to label settlement goods and services that they may enter into another market. It means that non-recognition is that those goods cannot enter into that market, whether under favorable terms or not. Any means of trade that involves trade and therefore the encouragement of economic activity in the Israeli settlements winds up in sustaining their growth, encouraging their development, and thereby postponing the day when we're going to reach a peaceful and just settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If I can give you as a preview, this will be the topic of my next report in October to the General Assembly, is on the issue of third state responsibility and accountability. I will be addressing all these questions at that time.
Thank you. Representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Chairman, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted at the outset to thank you for organizing this United Nations Forum on the question of Palestine. We are grateful for your efforts, and we're also grateful to the briefers and speakers of the first panel. Mr. Moderator, I have 6 general remarks I would like to make on behalf of my country's delegation. First, 70 years have gone by and our fellow Palestinian people are still living under occupation with the threat of annexation based on the analyses that we heard from the panel this morning. The Israeli authorities continue to flout international law and they are imposing a policy in apologies. If you could just speak a little bit more slowly for the interpreters. Yes, I'll begin again. This Palestinian occupation is flouting international law and is imposing a de facto policy to expand these activities of settlements in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, but also the economic blockade against Gaza. This requires the international community to raise its voice and to pool its efforts such as to find and take measures to put an end to this policy, which is in contravention of any peaceful solution. 3, Tunisia fully supports the United Nations values, and we also uphold its charter and international law and international legitimacy. These are the premises for international law. Thus, we insist on the need to develop an united international policy that rejects this de facto occupation, and we must support the United Nations and its noble values. 4, the international community, and especially the United Nations, must today more than ever change its approach to the Palestinian approach and find ways and credible means of finding a peaceful and lasting solution which will enable the Palestinian people to enjoy their rights, because the current situation is such that tensions are worsening and Palestinians are frustrated because of this injustice, and I am sure that this will have consequences that will go beyond that part of the region. My country's delegation, fifthly, insists in saying that any initiative that does not take into consideration the references to the two-state solution will only fail and prevent any further progress. 6, the delegation of my country insists on the need to pool efforts to alleviate the economic situation facing UNRWA and enable it to play its role in protecting the rights and dignity of Palestinian people while we await a just and peaceful solution to the Palestinian question in line with international law. Mr. Moderator, the Palestinian cause was considered during the Arab League summit this month in Tunisia, which is testament to the fact that this is a key issue in the Arab community. Whether it's in the regional or international fora, our Arab leaders have always asserted the fact that they will pursue efforts to relaunch serious and effective negotiations based on a predefined schedule that will enable us to arrive at a compromise that will bring comprehensive and lasting peace in line with international law, as well as the two-state solution. Our Arab heads of state also stressed the need that the security, peace, and prosperity of the Middle East will be based primarily on a comprehensive and a just solution to the Palestinian conflict and to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Tunisia will continue to support this cause. And this is a just cause, and we will make every effort to mobilize the international community to bring and lend support to the people of Palestine and to ensure that the state of Palestine will become a full-fledged member of our organization. And I would like you to find how we can have this translated.
Any questions to any of our panelists from, it's open to all. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for this panel. It was very informative. My question is to Ambassador Baruch. You mentioned about if Netanyahu loses.
Could you present yourself? I don't see what is.
Yeah, my name is Shireen Yassin, and I work with the Mission of Palestine, the State of Palestine, to the United Nations. And my question to you is about, you mentioned that if Netanyahu loses, then it's the legacy that he leaves behind, and you're inclining that the effect will take a long time before someone else comes and changes the situation. So could you elaborate on that? And also, could you please tell me which of the candidates in the next elections that you think that if Netanyahu loses will win, and what changes will they make? Thank you.
Yes, if to be a bit more accurate, I said that even if Netanyahu loses, and I earlier suggested that pundits in Israel believe Netanyahu will be the winner of the coming elections. But my argument was that he has left behind him, even if he loses, a zeitgeist, a way of collective perception of the position of Israel in regards to its relationship with the Palestinian, which is, in my view, is ailing, requires a lot of effort to redress the collective attitude of Israelis towards Palestine and towards our future relations with Palestine. The latest polls suggest that 42% of Israelis believe that one or another form of annexation of the West Bank serves Israeli interests and is possible. This is devastating news for people like myself, because it says nothing about reality. It says a lot about perceptions and about the public mood. And I think that the public mood in this respect is not the result of things that are happening in reality, but as a result of a psyche that was cleverly designed by political means under Netanyahu. And I'm waiting in despair, if you want, for the moment someone will pick up and create an alternative, more successful and more positive and more conducive state of mind in Israel towards Palestine. And I'm working on this now for the last couple of years, but from a very humble position. I am not a politician, and I don't have the instruments of politics to change the mind. But it must be said that the international community could actually have an impact on the Israeli perceptions of the relations with Palestine in another direction, more positive, more conducive to settling our differences with the Palestinians. Thank you.
Are there any further questions from the audience? Yes. No, yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Jessica Bernstein. I'm the Director of International Relations at Gisha, Legal Center for Freedom of Movement. Gisha is an Israeli human rights organization that works to protect and promote the right to freedom of movement for Palestinians, primarily residents of the Gaza Strip. Founded in 2005, Gisha assists individuals to exercise their right to freedom of movement, conducts legal advocacy aimed at effecting policy change, and engages in public advocacy directed at both local and international audiences. Gisha promotes rights guaranteed by international and Israeli law and works within the Israeli court and administrative systems to advance these rights. Gisha is the only Israeli organization with a programmatic focus on Gaza. While Gisha's work focuses on Gaza, I requested the floor today to speak about how what is happening in Gaza is connected to the subject of this forum, the de facto annexation primarily of the West Bank. For nearly 3 decades now, Israel has restricted movement between Gaza and the West Bank down to its current level, where separation between the two parts of the Palestinian territory is the rule and access is the rare exception. Following Israel's disengagement from Gaza in 2005, these restrictions remained the primary way Israel continues to exercise control over Gaza, with implications for every aspect of life in the Strip. Following Hamas's rise to power in 2007, the borders between Israel and Gaza were closed to entrance of most and exit of all goods, causing economic activity in the Strip to grind to a halt. Although small shifts in policy and in the numbers and types of people and goods that are permitted to enter and exit Gaza have changed over the years, the overarching policy remains the same. Movement and access to and from the Gaza Strip are limited to what Israel refers to as exceptional humanitarian circumstances and a minimal amount of travel for trade. Over time, these restrictions have devastated civilian life in both Gaza and the West Bank, separating families, restricting access to educational opportunities and health services, and de-developing the Palestinian economy. Many of the restrictions on movement and access vis-a-vis Gaza are manifestations of what is referred to as the separation policy, the systematic effort to separate and isolate Gaza from the West Bank. At Gisha, we see this policy at work in hundreds of cases each year. We see it in the prohibition against students from Gaza studying in the West Bank, in place since the year 2000. We see it in the denial of travel permits to Gaza residents who have a family member who traveled to the West Bank and did not return. And we see it in the rules around Palestinian residency status, which make it impossible to change one's registered address from Gaza to the West Bank, regardless of family ties or personal history there.
Thank you. Actually, it was the purpose is to provide an opportunity to members of the audience, if they wish to pose any questions to one or more of our panelists, and you're reading a lengthy statement. And so with all due respect, I'm going to have to interrupt you so that I can still, in the few minutes that are left, provide an opportunity to members of the audience should they wish to ask a question. Well, since there don't seem to be any more questions, we are very short of time. I would like to perhaps ask a question of my own, which is that all 3 panelists have referred to the American recognition of the Israeli annexation of Jerusalem, or of East Jerusalem, and of the Golan Heights. And I think it was you, Ambassador Baruch, who referred to this as not in and of itself significant, but important mainly as a precedent for the West Bank. But if I'm not mistaken, there's a fundamental difference, which is that in East Jerusalem, or in Jerusalem, and in the Golan Heights, the United States is recognizing actions that Israel has already taken in some decades ago. How could the United States recognize Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank unless Israel were to first itself take the measure to formally annex the West Bank? And isn't that going to be a substantially more difficult measure for Israel to take, given the issues of political will that Michael Lynk was talking about? And if I could please ask you to be brief, since we do have to conclude. Thank you.
Yes, yes. I just want to make let our august members present here realize that there is a line of Israeli activist NGOs, Gisha is one of which are all committed to make sure that the Palestinian rights, human rights, are being preserved in the face of a government that is undermining Palestinian human rights. So thank you, Jessica, for introducing Gisha here. As of the American, it is very obvious that the American administration is serving domestic American political expediency at the expense of a very, very fragile and fragmented theater of political movement and delivery in Palestine, Israel. And it is doing so cynically. And it is not only statements, but also symbols. Take, for example, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, in his last visit, joined Netanyahu in standing in front of the Wailing Wall, indisputably a holy site for us Jews, but also in the neighborhood of the holy site for the Muslims. Every country in the world was very careful not to introduce manifestations of recognition, even if not explicitly stated, to Jerusalem beyond the Green Line. And the Wailing Wall is beyond the Green Line. It must be understood. And I think that the Americans are doing a grave mistake in that. And I don't think that it is not right for someone who is representing civil society to stand up to the American might and say, you are simply wrong. You have been wrong in the past, and be careful not to be wrong in the future. And this room here, this hall, this congregation of representatives from all over the world need to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, if you could perhaps limit your response to 1 minute or less, because I've just been informed we're going to lose our interpretation services in a few minutes.
One can hope, but perhaps with a faint hope, that there's a glimmer of realism that may await the release of the coming American peace plan. I think a Middle East realist may think otherwise. What I fear is one of two things. Either the peace plan that will be presented sometime in the spring or summer, according to Washington, will be so under the minimum that the Palestinians will accept, that they will have to say no immediately, which will then end that. And every indication as to how the Americans have conducted their relations with the Israelis and the Palestinians over the last several years suggests that is a plausible pattern. What's more worrisome to me, particularly given the theme of what we're talking about today, is that the government of Israel will then ask or tell the United States that given the rejectionism of the Palestinians towards an eminently fair and just peace plan, we would like you to green light our ability to annex the territories that were already laid out in the peace plan. So I think it's plausible that we will see annexation now being transferred to the West Bank in the aftermath of the release of the peace plan in the next couple of months, and that's something the international community has to be prepared to react to.
Thank you. I would, before turning over to the chair, I would like to thank once again Raji Sourani and the Gaza Strip, and both Ilan Baruch and Michael Lynk with us here. Thank you very much, Mrs.
Thank you, Mr. Rabbani. We're grateful to all the representatives of member states and organizations that took the floor today. We're also grateful to the panelists and our moderator. You were very ably managed the time. And this brings us to the end of this first panel. And I'd like to remind you that we will have the second panel this afternoon at 3 p.m. So I'd like to invite you to come back then. The meeting is suspended.
Pleasure meeting you.
Right on.